Imagine working your way up from nothing to become a senior hiring manager at one of the most prestigious tech firms in Seattle. You paid your own way through college, took on massive student debt, worked 3 jobs while studying, and clawed your way up the corporate ladder through sheer determination. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Now imagine opening your email one morning to find a job application from none other than your own brother, the same brother whose failed tech startup swallowed your entire college fund because your parents thought he was a better investment. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it? My name is Ethan Miller. I grew up in a middle-class suburb of Portland with my parents, Linda and Robert, and my older brother, Jason. My childhood was pretty normal. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. My parents were both teachers who believed in, the value of education and hard work. From an early age, my brother Jason was labeled the genius of the family. He was building computers by age 10, coding his own games by 12, and everyone just knew he was destined for greatness. Our parents never tried to hide their favoritism. They'd beam with pride whenever anyone asked about Jason and his latest projects. Me? I was the quiet, studious one. I got good grades, but I wasn't a prodigy. I played basketball, had a small circle of friends, and worked part-time at the local grocery store during high school. My parents weren't disappointed in me or anything. I just existed in Jason's shadow. When I was 14, my grandparents passed away within months of each other. It was devastating for all of us, but there was one silver lining. They had set up college funds for both Jason and me. Each fund contained about $80,000, enough to cover 4 years at a decent state school. My parents were named as trustees until we turned 18. Jason was already in his second year at MIT, studying computer science on a partial scholarship. His college fund was covering the rest. I was still 4 years away from college, but knowing that fund was there gave me peace of mind. I started researching schools with strong business programs, dreaming of becoming a marketing executive someday. Fast forward to my senior year of high school. I was 17, maintaining a 3.8 GPA, and had just been accepted to the University of Washington's Business School. I was ecstatic. UW had an excellent reputation, and Seattle seemed like the perfect place to start building my future. One evening, I sat down with my parents to discuss finances and logistics for the fall. That's when they dropped the bomb. "Ethan, honey, we need to talk about your college fund," my mom began, exchanging nervous glances with my dad. Dad cleared his throat. "Jason has developed this incredible app that's going to revolutionize how people invest in cryptocurrency. He just needs some seed money to get it off the ground." I remember feeling a sudden chill. "What does that have to do with my college fund?" Mom reached for my hand. "We've decided to invest your college fund in Jason's startup. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, sweetie. He's projecting returns of at least 500% within 2 years. I pulled my hand away. "You what? You can't do that. That money is for my education." "It's technically still in your name," Dad explained, as if that made it better. "When the profits start rolling in, you'll have way more than the original amount. You'll be able to attend any college you want." "But I need that money now. I'm starting college in 3 months." My voice cracked as the reality of the situation sank in. Mom's expression hardened slightly. "You can take out student loans like most kids do, or maybe consider community college for a couple of years until Jason's company takes off. Or you could work for Jason," Dad suggested brightly. "He's going to need marketing help eventually. It could be a great opportunity." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The money my grandparents had specifically set aside for my education was gone, poured into my brother's latest scheme without my knowledge or consent. And my parents were acting like they'd done me a favor. That night, I called Jason, hoping that maybe he'd refuse the money once he understood the situation. Instead, he seemed annoyed that I was bothering him with this. "Look, Ethan, this is business. The app is going to be huge. I'm talking about potential acquisition by Google or Facebook within 3 years. Mom and Dad made a smart investment. Decision. It wasn't their decision to make, I shouted. That was my college fund. Consider it an investment in your future, too, Jason replied coolly. You'll thank me when you're cashing in your share. What share? No one's mentioned anything about me having a share. There was a pause. Well, your family. Obviously, we'll take care of you when it takes off. No contract, no written agreement. Just a vague promise from someone who had never really seen me as an equal. That conversation changed everything for me. I realized I couldn't count on my family to have my back. If I wanted a future, I'd have to build it myself. I threw myself into scholarship applications, staying up until 2 a.m. most nights after finishing my homework and working shifts at the grocery store. I managed to secure a partial academic scholarship to UW, but it only covered about 40% of the tuition. For the rest, I took out student loans, lots of them. I also found a job as a night security guard at an office building near campus, working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 4 nights a week. Between that and a weekend job at a coffee shop, I barely had time to sleep, let alone enjoy the college experience everyone talks about. My first semester, I lived in the cheapest dorm on campus, but even that was too expensive. For the remaining years, I shared a tiny off-campus apartment with 3 other students. We were all broke, all drowning in debt, all working multiple jobs while trying to maintain decent GPAs. Meanwhile, Jason's cryptocurrency app, CryptoWave, had launched to modest attention in the tech world. My parents couldn't stop talking about it during our rare phone calls. Jason just hired his 5th employee, or Jason was featured in a tech blog. They never asked about my classes or how I was managing financially. By my junior year, the constant work and stress had taken a toll. I developed insomnia and anxiety. My grades slipped to a 3.2 GPA, still respectable, but not what I'd hoped for. I started to wonder if all this struggle was worth it. Then, during the winter break of my junior year, I got a call from my mother. She was crying. "It's CryptoWave," she sobbed. "The company's bankrupt. Jason lost everything." As it turned out, Jason had made a series of high-risk investments with the company funds, betting on volatile cryptocurrencies that had subsequently crashed. The app itself had technical issues that never got resolved. Users abandoned it in droves, and the few investors he'd managed to attract pulled out. My college fund, all $80,000 of it, was gone. And not just mine. My parents had remortgaged their house to give Jason more money when things started looking shaky. They were now in significant debt with their retirement savings depleted. You know what's strange? I didn't feel any satisfaction, knowing Jason had failed. I just felt tired. Tired of the whole situation. Tired of the unfairness. Tired of my parents never acknowledging their role in this mess. When I asked if Jason had a backup plan, my mom said he was taking some time to regroup, which apparently meant moving back into his old bedroom and playing video games all day. "He's really depressed, Ethan," Mom explained. This was his dream. I bit my tongue to keep from saying, "And what about my dream? The one you sacrificed for his?" Instead, I focused on what I could control. I doubled down on my studies, took on a 3rd job doing social media management for a local restaurant, and started applying for marketing internships. By some miracle, I landed a summer internship at Horizon Tech, a mid-sized software company in Seattle. The pay was decent, and more importantly, they were impressed with my work. At the end of the summer, they offered me a part-time position during my senior year with the promise of full-time employment after graduation. I graduated with my business degree, $97,000 in student loan debt, and bags under my eyes that made me look a decade older than my 22 years. But I also had something none of my family expected, a legitimate job offer in the tech industry. My first few years at Horizon Tech were a grind. I started in their marketing department, creating content and managing campaigns. I lived in A studio apartment the size of a shoebox, eating ramen and working 60-hour weeks. Every spare dollar went toward my student loans. I rarely went home to Portland. The few times I did, Jason was still living with our parents, supposedly working on his next big idea. He'd cycle through phases of enthusiasm about new projects, then crash into depression when they didn't immediately take off. My parents continued to support him financially, even as they struggled to make mortgage payments. Once, during a particularly tense Thanksgiving dinner, I asked Jason if he ever felt guilty about taking my college fund. He looked genuinely surprised. "That was years ago, Ethan. Why are you still hung up on that? It was a business decision that didn't work out." "A business decision you made with my money," I pointed out. "Mom and Dad made that decision, not me." He shrugged. "Besides, you're doing fine. You've got a job and everything." That was the moment. I realized Jason would never understand what his actions had cost me, not just financially, but emotionally. The sleepless nights, the constant stress, the feeling of betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect me. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. 4 years into my career at Horizon Tech, the company was acquired by Pinnacle Innovations, one of the largest tech firms in the country. Most employees were nervous about the acquisition, but I saw an opportunity. During the transition, I worked harder than ever, taking on extra projects and making sure my contributions were visible to the new management. My strategy paid off. 6 months after the acquisition, I was promoted to marketing team lead. A year later, I became marketing manager. The promotions came with significant salary increases, allowing me to finally move into a decent one-bedroom apartment and accelerate my student loan payments. By the time I turned 28, I had paid off my student loans, built up a respectable savings account, and was being groomed for a senior management position. My hard work and determination had paid off in ways I never could have imagined when I was that broke, exhausted college student. Last year, at 30, I was promoted to Senior Talent Acquisition Manager at Pinnacle Innovations. Part of my job now involves reviewing applications for mid to senior level marketing positions and conducting initial interviews. It's a role that comes with significant influence over who joins our rapidly growing team. My personal life has improved too. I bought a condo overlooking Lake Union, started dating someone wonderful named Sarah who works in healthcare, and even adopted a dog, a rescue mutt named Cooper, who's currently the light of my life. I still don't visit Portland much. My relationship with my parents remains strained, though we've reached a kind of detente. They finally seem to respect my career success, though they've never apologized for what happened with my college fund. As for Jason, he's bounced between various jobs and startup attempts, never sticking with anything for more than a few months. And that brings us to last Monday. I was going through a batch of applications for our new digital marketing strategist position, a role that requires at least 5 years of solid marketing experience, demonstrated leadership skills, and a track record of successful campaigns. As I scrolled through the applicant names, one jumped out at me. Jason Miller, my brother, had applied to work at my company, under my direct supervision. I opened his resume with shaking hands. It was creative, to say the least. He'd listed himself as CEO and founder of CryptoWave for 3 years, described it as a strategic learning experience rather than a bankruptcy, and somehow spun his subsequent string of short-term jobs into a narrative about diverse industry exposure. There was no mention of the 8-month employment gap I knew he'd had last year. No reference to the failed food delivery app he'd tried to launch 2 years ago with our parents' retirement account top-up. Just a glossy, inflated version of his work history that barely resembled reality. At the bottom of his resume, under References, He'd listed our parents and 2 friends from college I knew for a fact he hadn't spoken to in years. I sat back in my chair, stunned. The audacity was breathtaking. After everything that had happened, after taking my college fund and watching me struggle while he lived comfortably with our parents, Jason now wanted me to give him a job. A job he wasn't remotely qualified for. And the most ironic part? The starting salary for this position was $110,000, more than the total amount of student debt I'd had to take on because of him. Closed the application and stared out the window at the Seattle skyline, trying to process my thoughts. What should I do? The professional thing would be to recuse myself from the hiring decision due to conflict of interest. But another part of me wanted to be the one to reject him, to let him feel, just for a moment, what it was like to have his future in someone else's hands. So now I have a decision to make. Do I forward his application with a note about our relationship? Do I reject it outright? Or do I call him in for an interview and confront him face to face about everything that's happened between us? Whatever. I decide, one thing is clear. The tables have turned in a way none of us could have predicted. The brother who was always the better investment now wants me to invest in him, and I honestly don't know if I can. After discovering Jason's application, I couldn't focus on anything else for the rest of the day. My mind kept cycling through memories. The night my parents told me my college fund was gone, the countless sleepless nights working security while trying to study, the crushing weight of my student loans. I canceled my afternoon meetings and went home early, something I never do. Sarah immediately knew something was wrong when I walked through the door at 3 p.m. on a Monday. "What happened?" she asked, looking up from her laptop where she'd been working on patient files. I collapsed onto our couch, Cooper immediately jumping up to nuzzle against me. My brother applied for a job at Pinnacle, under my department. Sarah knew the whole story. We'd been dating for 2 years, and early on I'd shared everything about my family situation. She's one of the few people who understands why I keep my distance from them. "Wow," she said, closing her laptop. "That's bold of him." "Bold? It's delusional," I replied. "He's completely unqualified. His resume is mostly fiction, and he had to know I'd see it." Sarah sat beside me, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's exactly why he applied. Maybe he wants to force a conversation. I hadn't considered that angle. Was this Jason's misguided attempt to reconnect? Or did he genuinely think I would help him get a job he didn't deserve? "You have 3 options," Sarah said pragmatically. She's always been good at breaking down complex emotional situations. 1, you recuse yourself and let someone else handle his application. 2, you reject it outright. Or 3, you interview him. If I interview him, I'd be giving him special treatment. There's no way his application would make it past our initial screening otherwise. "True," she acknowledged, "but maybe you need this for closure. Maybe you both do." I spent that night tossing and turning, weighing my options. The professional thing would be to recuse myself. That's what our HR handbook would recommend. But something inside me couldn't let go of the opportunity to finally confront Jason about everything that had happened between us. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would interview him, not to give him special treatment, but to hear what he had to say for himself. 10 years had passed since the college fund incident. Maybe it was time to address it head-on. I emailed our HR coordinator, explaining that the candidate was my brother, and asking if I could still conduct the initial interview given our relationship. She consulted with her manager, who said it was fine as long as I wasn't the only decision-maker in the hiring process. If Jason made it past the first round, someone else would need to conduct the second interview. Then I scheduled the interview for Friday morning. I sent Jason a brief professional email confirming the time and included our standard pre-interview information package. He responded almost immediately with a simple, "Looking forward to it. Thanks, E." He hadn't called me E since we were kids. The next few days were a blur of meetings and deadlines, but my mind kept drifting to the upcoming interview. What would I say to him? How much of our personal history should I bring up in a professional setting? Thursday night, I stayed late at the office preparing. I reviewed Jason's application materials thoroughly, noting all the discrepancies and exaggerations. I also pulled up our standard interview questions for the digital marketing strategist position and added a few specific ones based on the experiences he'd claimed. If I was going to interview him, I would do it properly. No favoritism, no softballs. Friday morning arrived. I wore my best suit, the one I save for important client meetings, and arrived at the office an hour early to gather my thoughts. At precisely 10 a.m., my phone rang. Reception calling to let me know my candidate had arrived. I walked to the lobby, my heart pounding. And there he was, Jason. My brother, who I hadn't seen in over 8 months. He was wearing a suit that looked new but slightly ill-fitting. His hair was neatly combed and he was clean-shaven. He looked nervous. Our eyes met, and for a second, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. Then he broke into his characteristic confident smile and extended his hand. "Ethan, great to see you, man." I shook his hand firmly, maintaining my professional demeanor. "Hello, Jason. Please follow me to the interview room." As we walked through the office, I could feel him taking everything in. The sleek, modern workspace, the view of the Seattle skyline, the casual but focused energy of my colleagues. I wondered if he was imagining himself working here or just calculating how successful I'd become without his or our parents' help. Once we were seated in the conference room, I placed his resume on the table between us. So, digital marketing. Strategist, I began, keeping my tone neutral. What made you interested in this position? Jason cleared his throat. Well, I've been following Pinnacle's growth for years. Your market penetration strategy is impressive, and I think my experience with various digital platforms would be valuable to your team. I nodded, making a note on my pad. You've listed CryptoWave as your most significant leadership experience. Can you tell me more about that venture and why it ended? A flash of discomfort crossed his face. He hadn't expected me to go straight for the jugular. CryptoWave was ahead of its time, he said, slipping into what sounded like a well-rehearsed explanation. We developed an innovative trading algorithm, but the crypto market volatility in 2017 created unforeseen challenges. I made the difficult decision to wind down operations rather than seek additional funding. I looked up from my notepad. So it wasn't that you ran out of investor money after making several high-risk trades that didn't pay off? Jason's face reddened. That's a simplification of a complex business situation. I see. I looked down at his resume again. You've listed strategic advisor for NextBite Delivery during 2022. Their website doesn't mention you, and the company appears to have never launched. Can you clarify your role there? For the next 20 minutes, I methodically worked through his resume, questioning each inflated claim and asking for specific examples that he struggled to provide. I wasn't being cruel. I was asking the same questions I would ask any candidate who submitted a resume with such obvious discrepancies. Finally, I set my notepad down. Jason, I have to be honest. Your qualifications don't match what we're looking for in this role. You don't have the 5 years of consistent marketing experience we require, your leadership claims are unverifiable, and several of your listed projects never made it to market. He stared at me, a mix of embarrassment and anger flickering across his face. Is that really why you brought me in here? To humiliate me? I brought you in because you applied for a position in my department. I'm evaluating you as I would any candidate. Bullshit, he snapped, his professional facade cracking. This is about the college fund, isn't it? You're still holding that against me after all these years. And there it was, the real conversation we needed to have. You know what, Jason? You're right. This isn't just about your qualifications. It's about integrity. It's about accountability. Two things you've never demonstrated, either professionally or personally. That's not fair. Let me finish, I said, my voice steady but intense. You took my college fund, money our grandparents set aside specifically for my education, and you lost it. You never apologized. You never acknowledged the impact it had on my life. Instead, you lived at home while I worked 3 jobs and took on crushing debt. Jason's expression hardened. Mom and Dad made that decision, not me. And you could have refused. You could have said, "No, that's Ethan's money." But you didn't. You took it because you've always believed you were entitled to more than me. He looked away, unable to hold my gaze. I was going to pay you back when Crypto Wave took off. With what? Stock options in a company that never had a viable business model? Promises that were never put in writing? I shook my head. And now you show up here, applying for a job you're not qualified for, with a resume full of half-truths. Expecting what exactly? That I'll help you because we're family? When did being family ever matter to you? The conference room fell silent. Through the glass walls, I could see colleagues walking past, oblivious to the decade of resentment being unloaded inside. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice quieter than before. I didn't come here just for the job, Ethan. Then why did you come? He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from our childhood. I'm in trouble. I owe money to some people. Serious money. Of course. It wasn't about reconnecting or making amends. It was about money. Again. What kind of trouble? I borrowed from some alternative lenders for my last startup attempt. The terms weren't great, but I was sure it would work out. Now they're threatening legal action. Maybe worse. He leaned forward. I need this job, E. I need a steady income, something legitimate to get back on my feet. I felt a familiar weariness settle over me. Why didn't you just ask for help directly instead of all this? I gestured to his resume. Would you have taken my call? He challenged. Besides, I thought if I could just get in the door, show you I'm serious about turning things around. I sat back, studying my brother. For the first time, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. He looked exhausted, desperate even. Despite everything, a part of me still cared what happened to him. How much do you owe? $45,000, he admitted. Plus interest that keeps compounding, almost exactly half of what had been in my college fund. I turned to look out at the Seattle skyline, gathering my thoughts. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all these years, Jason's financial recklessness had come full circle, and now he was, looking to me, the brother whose future he'd compromised, for salvation. I had options. I could pay off his debt. With my salary and bonuses, I could afford it, though it would deplete a significant portion of my savings. I could offer him a loan with clear terms. Or I could walk away, tell him that his problems weren't mine to solve, just as he'd implied about my college funding all those years ago. When I turned back, Jason was staring at the floor, his usual bravado completely gone. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my decision made. I'm not hiring you. You're not qualified for this position, and it would compromise my professional integrity to recommend you. His shoulders slumped. However, I continued, I know a small marketing agency that's looking for an entry-level account coordinator. The pay isn't great, about $45,000 a year, but it's legitimate work with growth potential. I'll make a call, but only if you agree to my conditions. Jason looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. What conditions? First, you need to be completely honest with them about your experience. No inflated titles, no exaggerated accomplishments. Second, you need to commit to at least 1 year there. No quitting when the next big idea strikes. Third, you need to take financial management classes. I'll pay for them, And the debt? He asked hesitantly. I took a deep breath. I'll help you negotiate with your lenders and cover half the amount. You'll pay me back, with interest, through monthly payments deducted automatically from your new salary. We'll draw up a legal agreement. Why would you do this for me after everything? It was a fair question. Why was I helping him when he'd never helped me? Because I'm not you, Jason. And I'm not mom and dad. I don't believe in abandoning family, even when they've hurt me. But my help comes with accountability, something you've never had. For a moment, I thought he might argue or storm out. Instead, he nodded slowly. I don't deserve your help. No, you don't, I agreed. But maybe this is your chance to start earning it. We spent the next hour outlining the details of our arrangement. I was clear that this was his last chance. I wouldn't bail him out again if he reverted to his old patterns. By the time we finished, the professional distance between us had softened slightly. Not enough for full reconciliation, but perhaps enough for a new beginning. As I walked Jason back to the lobby, he paused before the elevator. You know, when I saw your office, your position here, I was jealous, he admitted. You built all this yourself. No one handed it to you. I never had to work that hard for anything. It's not too late to start, I told him. The elevator doors opened. Jason extended his hand again, but this time with genuine respect in his eyes. Thank you, Ethan, for the opportunity and for not giving up on me completely. I shook his hand. Don't make me regret it. As I watched him leave, I felt a weight lifting, not completely, but noticeably. For 10 years, I'd carried the anger and resentment of that betrayal. It had fueled my drive to succeed, but it had also built a wall around my heart. That evening, I called my parents. It was a difficult conversation, full of long overdue truths about how their decision had affected me and my relationship with them. There were tears, defenses, and eventually, something resembling an apology from my father. My mother was still resistant, insisting they'd done what they thought was best at the time. Progress, not perfection. When I got home, Sarah was waiting with takeout and a bottle of wine. Cooper greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, oblivious to the emotional day I'd had. How did it go? She asked as we settled on our balcony overlooking the lake. I told her everything. The interview, Jason's debt problems, our agreement, the call with my parents. Are you sure about helping him? She asked, concerned. After everything he put you through? I sipped my wine, considering the question. I'm helping him because it's the right thing to do. But I'm not doing it blindly this time. There are terms, consequences. Sarah squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. That couldn't have been easy. The strange thing is, I reflected, in some ways, I should thank him and my parents. Thank them? For what? If they hadn't taken my college fund, I might never have developed the work ethic and determination that got me here. I might have coasted through college and taken an average job somewhere. Adversity forced me to prove myself. To them, but more importantly, to myself. The sun was setting over Lake Union, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I thought about the long road that had brought me here and the unexpected turn it had taken today. Sometimes in life, the greatest betrayals lead to our greatest strengths. The people who should support us fail, and in that failure, we discover reservoirs of resilience we never knew we possessed. My brother's startup may have been the better investment in my parents' eyes, but they were measuring the wrong returns. True wealth isn't just about money, it's about character, integrity, and the ability to stand on your own when everyone else has let you down. Jason's journey is just beginning. Whether he'll learn the lessons he needs to, only time will tell. But my journey has reached a new chapter, one where I'm no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to build in its place. And maybe, just maybe, by choosing compassion over revenge. I've finally broken free from the last chains of that old betrayal. 2 months passed after my confrontation with Jason. True to my word, I'd contacted Caroline, a former colleague who now ran a boutique digital marketing agency called Spark Media. She agreed to interview Jason for the account coordinator position, with the clear understanding that I wasn't vouching for his skills, only that he deserved a chance if he was honest about his qualifications. To my surprise, Jason got the job on his own merits. Caroline told me he'd been refreshingly candid about his past failures and demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for learning the business from the ground up. It was a side of my brother I hadn't seen since we were kids, before the genius label, and parental favoritism had warped his perception of himself. I also kept my promise regarding his debt. After several tense phone calls with his creditors, I negotiated the total down to $38,000. I paid half up front, with Jason signing a legally binding agreement to repay me through monthly installments of $500. It would take him years to clear the debt, but the structured payment plan gave him a path forward. The most unexpected development came from my parents. A week after my phone call with them, a thick envelope arrived at my condo. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father and a cashier's check for $25,000. The letter began, "Dear Ethan, this doesn't come close to replacing what we took from you, but it's a start. We've been selling items from the house and have taken on extra tutoring jobs to raise this money. Your mother still struggles to admit the full extent of our mistake, but she agreed this was necessary." He went on to acknowledge how their favoritism had damaged both their sons, giving Jason an inflated sense of entitlement while making me feel perpetually second best. The letter wasn't perfect. There were still attempts to justify their decision, but it represented more accountability than I'd ever expected from him. I didn't cash the check immediately. Part of me wanted to return it, to prove I didn't need their money now, just as I'd managed without it before. But Sarah helped me see that rejecting their attempt at amends would only perpetuate the cycle of hurt. So I deposited it into a separate account, earmarked for a purpose I hadn't yet determined. My relationship with Jason evolved cautiously. We began meeting for coffee every other Sunday, neutral territory where we could slowly rebuild some semblance of brotherhood. The first few meetings were awkward, punctuated by long silences and superficial conversation. But by the third month, something shifted. Jason had received his first performance review at Spark Media, exceeding expectations in client communication, while still developing his technical marketing skills. It was the first genuine professional accomplishment he'd achieved without exaggeration or family connections. "The weird thing is," he admitted during one of our coffee meetings, "I actually like the structure. Having clear expectations, regular feedback, concrete goals to hit. It's, I don't know, satisfying in a way that always chasing the next big thing never was." I nodded, recognizing the transformation happening in real time. "That's how most careers work, Jason. Gradual competence building on itself. Not everyone gets to be Mark Zuckerberg." He winced. "Yeah, I think I watched too many tech founder biopics growing up. That and mom and dad treating me like I was destined for immediate greatness." "They did you no favors with that," I agreed. "No, they didn't," he sighed. "But I was a willing participant in my own delusion. That's on me." This newfound self-awareness marked a significant step forward. Jason was finally taking responsibility for his choices rather than blaming circumstances or other people when things didn't go his way. Meanwhile, my own career continued to flourish. I was promoted to Director of Talent Acquisition at Pinnacle, overseeing recruitment strategy for the entire Seattle office. The role came with another substantial salary increase and equity in the company. Sarah and I got engaged, planning a small wedding for the following spring. We also began looking at houses in the Wallingford neighborhood, a step up from my downtown condo, with room for potentially starting a family in the future. My relationship with my parents remained complicated. We spoke more regularly now, but there was still an undercurrent of tension. They'd visit Seattle occasionally, marveling at my professional success while carefully avoiding any meaningful discussion about the past. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One Sunday evening, about 8 months after Jason had started at Spark Media, he called me sounding genuinely excited. "Remember that insurance company client I told you about? The one with the terrible social media presence?" He began without even saying hello. "Vaguely," I replied, putting him on speaker so Sarah could hear as I prepared dinner. "I developed a complete digital strategy overhaul for them. Content calendar, platform-specific approaches, paid campaign structure, and the works. Pitched it to Caroline yesterday, and she's presenting it to the client next week with me in the room." "That's great, Jason," I said, genuinely impressed. He'd been hired as an account coordinator, mainly handling administrative tasks and learning the ropes. Developing and potentially presenting client strategy was a significant step up. If they approve it, Caroline said I might get promoted to junior strategist, he continued. It would mean a raise, more client-facing work. As he detailed his proposal, I exchanged glances with Sarah. The enthusiasm in his voice wasn't the manic energy of his startup days, the gold rush mentality that had led to impulsive decisions and inevitable crashes. This was different. The measured excitement of someone who had put in the work and earned an opportunity. "I'm proud of you," I told him when he finally paused for breath. And I meant it. The following month, Sarah and I drove down to Portland for Thanksgiving. The first time I'd voluntarily returned for a holiday in years. We'd agreed to stay at a hotel rather than at my parents' house, maintaining some emotional distance while still making the effort to reconnect. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the lawn a bit overgrown, the paint starting to peel in places. My parents had always been house-proud, but financial struggles had clearly taken their toll. Jason arrived shortly after us, having taken the bus from Seattle. He carried a bottle of wine and a homemade cranberry sauce that his new girlfriend had helped him prepare. The girlfriend couldn't make it. She was visiting her own family in Chicago, but her influence was apparent in small ways. Jason looked healthier, his clothes more put together, his demeanor more grounded. When my mother opened the door, I saw her eyes widen slightly as she took in the three of us standing on her porch, her sons, and the woman who would soon become her daughter-in-law, all successful adults making the choice to be there. "You all made it," she said softly, as if she'd half expected us to cancel at the last minute. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. We avoided contentious topics, focusing instead on Sarah's work in healthcare, Jason's progress at Spark Media, and my recent promotion. My father seemed genuinely interested in our lives, asking thoughtful questions and listening attentively to the answers. It wasn't until dessert that my mother broached the subject we'd all been dancing around. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, setting down her fork, "about the past, about the choices your father and I made." The table fell silent. Jason and I exchanged glances, neither of us sure where this was heading. "We were wrong," she continued, her voice wavering slightly. "About so many things. We put unfair pressure on Jason to be exceptional, to be the success story we could brag about to our colleagues. And she looked directly at me. "We failed. You, Ethan. Completely and utterly failed you when we took your college fund." I sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. This was the explicit acknowledgement I'd been waiting years to hear. "I convinced myself it was the right decision at the time," she continued, "that Jason's startup was a sure thing, that we were just being smart investors. But the truth is, I was playing favorites. I've always played favorites, and it hurts both of you in different ways." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I'm so sorry. More sorry than I can ever express. And I'm so proud of the man you've become, Ethan, not because of anything your father and I did, but despite what we did." The room was silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. I felt Sarah's hand find mine under the table, squeezing gently in support. "Thank you for saying that," I finally managed, my own voice thick with emotion. My father reached across the table to place his hand on my mother's. "We can't change the past, but we want to be better going forward, if you'll let us." That conversation marked a turning point, not an instant resolution. There were too many years of hurt for that, but a foundation for something healthier. For the first time, my parents were seeing me clearly, valuing my journey without comparing it to Jason's. As Sarah and I drove back to Seattle the next day, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be helping Jason build a legitimate career, accepting an apology from my parents, and feeling genuinely optimistic about our family's future, I would have laughed in disbelief. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, noticing my contemplative mood. "Just how unpredictable life is," I replied, "and how sometimes the worst decisions people make can eventually lead to growth, if there's enough willingness to change." 3 weeks before Christmas, I received a surprising email from Jason's girlfriend, Melissa. She was planning a small surprise party to celebrate Jason's 6-month sobriety milestone, something I hadn't even known he was working toward. Apparently, alongside his financial management classes, Jason had been attending recovery meetings, acknowledging that his relationship with alcohol had become problematic during his darkest periods. It was yet another sign of his commitment to rebuilding his life on a more solid foundation. The party was small, just Melissa, me, Sarah, a couple of Jason's colleagues from Spark Media, and his sponsor from the recovery program. We gathered at Melissa's apartment, decorated with a simple 6 months banner and a non-alcoholic sparkling cider for toasting. When Jason arrived, expecting just a dinner with Melissa, the look of shock and then profound emotion on his face was something I'll never forget. These weren't the accomplishments our parents had groomed him to achieve. No tech breakthrough, no million-dollar acquisition. But the pride in the room was palpable. Later that evening, as Sarah chatted with Melissa in the kitchen, Jason pulled me aside. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "For what? The job connection? That was all you—" He shook his head. "Not just that. For not giving up on me when you had every reason to. For setting boundaries instead of cutting me off completely. You could have thrown my application in the trash and never looked back." Considered this. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have. But carrying that resentment was exhausting, Jason. At some point, I had to decide who I wanted to be. Someone defined by what was taken from me, or someone defined by what I chose to give. "Well, I'm grateful either way," he said, awkwardly pulling me into a hug, our first in many years. As Christmas approached, Sarah and I finally closed on our house in Wallingford, a charming craftsman with a small yard for Cooper and the family we hoped to start. We decided to host a housewarming dinner, combined with a small holiday celebration. To my surprise, my parents accepted our invitation to come up from Portland and stay for the weekend. They insisted on a hotel, not wanting to impose, but the gesture of traveling for the occasion meant a lot. The night before the gathering, I made a decision about the money my father had sent, the $25,000 I'd kept in a separate account. After discussing it with Sarah, I'd found the perfect purpose for it. When everyone arrived for dinner, Jason and Melissa, my parents, and a few close friends, the house was warm with the smell of Sarah's cooking and the glow of tasteful holiday decorations. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room for dessert, I clinked my glass to get everyone's attention. "Sarah and I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate our new home and the holiday season," I began. "This past year has been one of unexpected reconnections and healing for our family. It reminded me that while we can't change the past, we can choose how it shapes our future." I reached for a folder I'd placed on the side table. "Mom, Dad, the money you sent earlier this year was a meaningful gesture. I've been thinking about the best way to honor that gesture, and I've decided to establish a small scholarship fund. I opened the folder to show them the documentation from the community foundation I'd worked with. This scholarship will provide $5,000 annually to a student from our old high school who demonstrates financial need and academic promise. I've named it after Grandma and Grandpa, who believed so strongly in educational opportunity. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. My father simply nodded, too overcome to speak. The initial $25,000 you provided is the seed money, I continued. I've matched it with another $25,000 of my own, and the foundation will help us grow it over time so it can help students for years to come. What followed was one of those rare, perfect family moments, genuine embraces, heartfelt words, a sense of something broken being carefully, purposefully mended. As the new year began, life settled into a rhythm I could never have imagined back when I discovered Jason's job application. In my inbox, my brother was thriving at Spark Media, having officially been promoted to junior strategist after his insurance client enthusiastically approved his digital strategy plan. He was 8 months sober, in a healthy relationship, and paying his monthly debt installments without fail. My parents were making efforts to, calling regularly but respectfully, showing interest in my work without comparing it to some imagined alternative path, planning a trip to attend our wedding in the spring. One afternoon, as I was reviewing applications for a new position at Pinnacle, I received an unexpected email. It was from a talented marketing director I'd tried to recruit months earlier who had ultimately accepted a position with a competitor. She was reaching out to see if I still had any suitable openings. As I drafted my response, welcoming her to apply for our senior brand strategist role, I reflected on how differently I now viewed the concept of better investments. The truth is, the most valuable investments aren't always the ones that promise the quickest or most impressive returns. Sometimes, they're the ones that test our resilience, that force us to dig deeper and discover strengths we never knew we had. My parents thought Jason's startup was a better investment than my education. They were wrong, but not in the way I once believed. The real failure wasn't that his business collapsed. It was that they invested in an outcome rather than in us as people, with all our complexities and potential for growth. 10 years of struggle, resentment, and eventual reconciliation taught me that the best investments are the ones we make in each other's wholeness. Supporting dreams while acknowledging limitations, holding each other accountable while offering second chances, balancing consequences with compassion. I don't know what the future holds for our family. Healing is rarely a straight line. But I do know that when Jason's application landed on my desk that day, it opened a door I thought had been permanently closed. And sometimes, that's all any of us really need. Not a guarantee of success, but the opportunity to try again with new wisdom and humility. Maybe that's the best investment of all. 5 months after our holiday gathering, Sarah and I exchanged vows in a boutique garden venue overlooking Puget Sound. The ceremony was intimate, only 60 guests, but represented every chapter of my life, from childhood friends to college roommates who'd witnessed my struggles, firsthand, to colleagues who'd become like family. Jason stood beside me as my best man, a role I'd hesitated to offer, worried it might be too much pressure given his recovery journey. But when I finally asked, his response surprised me. "I've been hoping you would ask," he admitted. "But I would have understood if you didn't. I know I have to earn these moments now." That awareness, that trust and inclusion needed to be earned, rather than expected, marked how far he'd come. My parents sat in the front row, my mother dabbing at tears throughout the ceremony. During the reception, my father pulled me aside while Sarah was dancing with her father. "I keep thinking about what your grandfather would say if he were here today," he said, his voice catching. "He'd be so damn proud of you, son, not just for your success, but for the man you've become, the way you've handled everything, with far more grace than your mother and I deserved." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without emotion overwhelming me. My grandfather had been a man of principle, someone who believed in working hard and treating people right. I'd thought about him often during my hardest years, wondering what advice he would have given me. "I hope you know," my father continued, "that establishing that scholarship in your grandparents' names was the perfect choice. Education meant everything to them." "I know," I replied. "That's why their betrayal cut so deep." It was the most direct reference I'd made to what had happened, and for a moment I thought I'd ruined the fragile peace of the day. But my father simply nodded, accepting the truth of it. "The scholarship fund is at $75,000 now," I told him, changing the subject slightly. 3 of my colleagues contributed after hearing about it. The first award will be presented this fall. Pride and regret mingled in his expression. Pride in what I'd created, regret for the circumstances that had inspired it. "Your grandfather always said that how we recover from our mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves. I'm still working on my recovery, Ethan. We both are." Across the reception venue, I could see my mother chatting animatedly with Sarah's parents, making a genuine effort to connect with this new branch of our family. Jason was on the dance floor with Melissa, looking happier and more at ease than I could remember seeing him in years. The path that had brought us here was far from what any of us had imagined. But standing there in that moment, I felt a sense of rightness, not because everything had been fixed or forgotten, but because we were all finally moving in a healthier direction. Exactly 1 year after Jason had walked into my office with his inflated resume and desperate circumstances, I received an email from Caroline at Spark Media. The subject line read, "Your brother is a rock star, but don't tell him I said that." Jason had been promoted to full digital strategist after bringing in 2 new clients through networking events and developing successful campaigns for their existing roster. His transformation from the entitled dreamer who believed success should come quickly and dramatically to a professional who understood the value of consistent effort had exceeded everyone's expectations, including, I suspect, his own. That same week, my parents called with news of their own. After years of financial strain from their investment in Jason's failed startup and subsequent attempts to help him, they'd finally sold their house in Portland. They were downsizing to a small condo, using the difference to pay off their remaining debts and rebuild their retirement savings. "We're thinking of moving closer to Seattle," my mother ventured hesitantly. "Not right away, but maybe in a year or 2 when we're both fully retired, if that wouldn't be uncomfortable for you and Sarah." A year earlier, the idea of my parents living nearby would have filled me with dread. Now, I found myself considering the practical benefits, especially as Sarah and I had just learned we were expecting our first child. "I think that could work," I told her. "We'd need to maintain some boundaries, but having you closer might be good for everyone." Her relieved sigh was audible through the phone. "That means a lot, Ethan, more than you know." As summer turned to fall, Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly. We converted one of the bedrooms in our Wallingford house into a nursery, painted a soft sage green with wooden furniture that Sarah's father had handcrafted. During this time, an unexpected opportunity arose at Pinnacle Innovations. The company was expanding its operations to Boston, and the executive team was considering who should relocate to establish the East Coast office. My name had been put forward as a potential candidate to head their talent acquisition efforts there. The role would mean a significant promotion, a substantial salary increase, and equity options that could set us up financially for decades. Under normal circumstances, I would have jumped at the chance. But now, with a baby on the way and the fragile rebuilding of family relationships in progress, the decision felt more complicated. Sarah and I spent weeks weighing the pros and cons. The opportunity was incredible professionally, but moving across the country would mean leaving behind the support network we'd established. It would also complicate the tentative healing process with my family. After much deliberation, I requested a meeting with Pinnacle's chief operating officer. I'm honored to be considered for the Boston position, I told her. But I need to be transparent about where I am in my life right now. My wife and I are expecting our first child in 3 months, and family considerations are taking priority. I proposed an alternative, overseeing the hiring strategy for the Boston office while remaining based in Seattle, with quarterly travel east for in-person meetings. I would build and train a local team who would execute the day-to-day operations. Essentially, I'd be the architect rather than the on-site contractor, I explained. It would provide continuity for the Seattle office while ensuring the Boston location has a solid foundation. To my surprise, the COO was receptive to the idea. "We're more interested in your expertise than your geography," she said. "If you can make this work while maintaining quality, I'm willing to try your approach." That evening, I shared the news with Sarah, who let out a relieved breath. "I was prepared to move if that's what you needed," she admitted. "But I'm glad we get to stay." This was the balance I'd been seeking: professional growth that didn't come at the expense of personal relationships. It wasn't compromise so much as integration, finding ways for different aspects of life to strengthen rather than compete with each other. On a crisp January morning, our daughter Elena Grace Miller was born, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that hinted they might turn green like Sarah's. Watching Sarah hold our daughter in the hospital room, overwhelmed with love and exhaustion, I experienced a clarity I'd never known before. This was what mattered. Not corporate ladders or vindication or old wounds, but the family we were creating and the love we chose to cultivate. My parents drove up from Portland the next day, bringing a hand-knitted blanket and barely contained excitement about their first grandchild. Jason and Melissa visited that weekend, bringing not only gifts, but also a meal service subscription to help us through the first month of new parenthood. As I watched my mother gently rocking Elena, tears streaming unashamedly down her face, I felt the last hard edges of resentment soften. Not because what happened didn't matter, but because I refused to let it define our future. Elena's future. 3 months into parenthood, I'd settled into a new routine, working partially from home to support Sarah and spend time with Elena. Pinnacle had been surprisingly accommodating, allowing me flexible hours as long as my teams performed well and the Boston office continued its successful launch. One evening, after putting Elena down for the night, I received a text from Jason, asking if we could meet for coffee the following weekend, just the two of us. His tone seemed serious, making me wonder if something was wrong. When we met at our usual cafe, he seemed nervous, fidgeting with his cup and avoiding eye contact initially. "Everything okay?" I prompted after several minutes of small talk. He took a deep breath. "Yeah, actually things are really good. That's sort of why I wanted to talk." He pulled out his phone and showed me a bank transfer receipt. "I made the final payment on my debt to you yesterday." I looked at the screen in surprise. According to our agreement, he should have had another 18 months of payments. "You paid it off early?" He nodded, a mixture of pride and nervousness on his face. "I got a bonus at work for bringing in that healthcare client, and Melissa and I have been living pretty frugally. I wanted to clear this debt completely." "That's impressive, Jason. Really." "There's more," he continued, putting his phone away. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did, establishing that scholarship in Grandma and Grandpa's names. It made me realize I've never properly made amends for taking your college fund." "You've been paying me back," I pointed out. "That was for the loan you gave me when I was in trouble with those lenders. It doesn't address the original theft." He said the word deliberately, not softening it with euphemisms. "I can't pay back the full amount right away, but I've opened a separate account. I'm putting in $500 every month until I've contributed $80,000 to the scholarship fund." I stared at him, genuinely stunned. "Jason, You don't have to. I do, he interrupted firmly. Not because you expect it, or because Mom and Dad are pressuring me, because it's the right thing to do. Because I want to be someone who makes things right, even when it's difficult. Someone like you. In that moment, I saw my brother, not as the golden child who'd been given everything at my expense, not as the desperate man who'd shown up at my office with a falsified resume, but as someone who was genuinely trying to rebuild himself with integrity. I'm proud of you, I told him, the words feeling inadequate for the emotion behind them. He smiled, looking both relieved and determined. I've got a long way to go, but I'm getting there. One payment, one day at a time. When Elena turned 1, we hosted a small birthday party in our backyard. The weather cooperated with blue skies and mild temperatures, perfect for the casual celebration we'd planned. My parents had indeed moved to Seattle, settling into a condo about 20 minutes from our house. The proximity had required careful boundary setting at first, but over time we'd established a healthy rhythm. They were involved grandparents who respected our parenting decisions and never tried to overcompensate for past mistakes by spoiling. Elena, Jason, and Melissa arrived bearing a gift they'd clearly put thought into. A custom-made growth chart with spaces for photos at different heights, handcrafted by an artist friend of Melissa's. They'd recently moved in together, taking the step deliberately after Jason had maintained his sobriety for 18 months. As everyone gathered around to watch Elena cautiously taste her first bite of birthday cake, I found myself taking mental snapshots of the scene, my daughter's face lighting up at the sweetness, Sarah laughing beside her, our extended family and friends forming a circle of support around them. The scholarship fund, now in its second year, had recently awarded grants to 2 students from our old high school. One was studying nursing, the other engineering, both the first in their families to attend college. They'd sent thank you letters that I'd framed in my home office as reminders that even painful experiences could eventually yield something positive. Life has a way of coming, full circle, but rarely in the ways we expect. 10 years ago, when my parents told me they'd given my college fund to Jason's startup, I could never have imagined the journey that would follow. The hardships, the growth, the eventual healing. If I could go back and speak to my 17-year-old self on that devastating night, I'm not sure what I would say. That the road ahead would be harder than he could imagine? That he would need to find strength he didn't know he possessed? That someday, the betrayal that seemed world-ending would become just one chapter in a much longer, richer story. Perhaps I would simply tell him that while he couldn't control what was happening to him, he could control who he became because of it. That the choice between bitterness and resilience would define not just his future, but the futures of people he hadn't even met yet. Sarah, Elena, the scholarship recipients, and yes, even the future versions of Jason and our parents. 3 years after that fateful job application landed on my desk, my professional life has evolved in exciting new directions. The remote leadership model I pioneered for the Boston office was so successful that Pinnacle has implemented it for other expansion locations. I now oversee talent strategy for our entire North American division, leading a team of regional managers while maintaining the work-life balance that allows me to be present for my family. Jason has continued his upward trajectory at Spark Media, recently being promoted to Director of Digital Strategy. He's also enrolled in night classes to finally complete his bachelor's degree, a step he took voluntarily, recognizing the gaps in his formal education despite his natural aptitude. My parents have settled into retirement, finding purpose in community volunteer work and, of course, grandparent duties. They've never fully forgiven themselves for what happened with my college fund. Perhaps they shouldn't. But they've shown through consistent actions that they've learned from their mistakes. The scholarship fund now supports 3 students annually and has inspired a matching program from my old high school's alumni association. What began as a response to injury has grown into something that will help dozens, perhaps hundreds of students over time. As for me, I've learned that healing isn't a destination but a practice. There are still moments when old resentments resurface, when I catch myself calculating the cost of what was taken from me. But those moments grow fewer and further between as I focus on what I've built rather than what I lost. The college fund my grandparents established was meant to be an investment in my future. In taking it, my parents and brother inadvertently forced me to invest in myself, my determination, my work ethic, my resilience. Those qualities have yielded returns far greater than any financial portfolio could have. Sometimes the deepest wounds become our greatest teachers, if we're willing to learn from them. My wound taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in dignity. That success built on your own terms is more satisfying than success that's handed to you. That family bonds can break and heal and transform into something different, but equally valuable. And perhaps most importantly, it taught me that while we don't choose the challenges life presents us, we always have a choice in how we respond. We can become bitter or better. We can perpetuate cycles of hurt or break them. The college fund that was deemed a better investment in my brother's startup ultimately failed financially. But the investment I made in myself, in my own future, in my capacity for both boundaries and forgiveness, that's the investment that continues to pay dividends I never could have imagined, and for that, strangely enough, I'm grateful. 5 years after Elena's birth, I found myself standing in front of a business ethics class at the University of Washington, the very institution I'd struggled so hard to attend. Professor Ramirez, who taught the senior seminar, had invited me as a guest speaker to discuss ethical leadership in corporate recruitment. Toward the end of my presentation, during the Q&A session, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Your career path is impressive," she said. "Did you always know you wanted to work in talent acquisition, or did you have a different plan initially?" The question seemed straightforward enough, but it sent my mind spinning back through the years, to the teenager who'd had his plans completely upended, to the exhausted college student working night shifts, to the determined young professional, clawing his way up the corporate ladder. "Actually," I said, setting aside my prepared notes, "my journey to this career wasn't direct at all. When I was your age, my plans were derailed by circumstances beyond my control. The path I ended up taking wasn't the one I would have chosen, but it led me to discover strengths I didn't know I had." The classroom fell silent as I shared a condensed version of my story. Not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as someone offering perspective on resilience and adaptation. I was careful not to villainize my family, focusing instead on the universal themes of disappointment, perseverance, and reconciliation. When I finished speaking, the students' expressions ranged, from thoughtful to visibly moved. Professor Ramirez thanked me for my candor, noting that such real-world ethical dilemmas were far more instructive than hypothetical scenarios from textbooks. As I gathered my materials after class, the young woman who'd asked the question approached me. "Thank you for sharing that," she said quietly. "I'm working 3 jobs to stay in school after my financial aid was cut. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." I looked at her, the determination in her eyes so familiar, and said, "The path is harder than it should be, but don't let that define what you're capable of achieving." I handed her my business card. "When you're ready to graduate, reach out. Pinnacle has an excellent internship program, and I'd be happy to put in a good word." Her face brightened. "Really? That would be amazing." Walking back to my car afterward, I realized that my story, the very thing I'd once been ashamed of, the struggle I'd tried to hide in those early professional years, had become a source of connection and, potentially, support for someone facing similar challenges. The following weekend, Jason and I met for what had become our monthly coffee meetup. Over the years, these gatherings had evolved from cautious attempts at reconciliation to genuine opportunities to connect as adults and equals. Melissa and I set a date, he announced as soon as I sat down, unable to contain his excitement. October 12th, small ceremony, close friends and family only. But we want Elena to be the flower girl. if that's okay with you and Sarah. I grinned, genuinely happy for my brother. She'll be thrilled, though I can't guarantee she'll actually drop the flowers instead of hoarding them. She's going through a collector phase. Jason laughed. Perfect. We'll just tell everyone it's an interpretive flower girl performance. He slid an envelope across the table. Also, we want you to be my best man. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Jason had stood up for me at my wedding 5 years earlier, and now I would do the same for him. But our circumstances are so different now. His relationship with Melissa was built on a foundation of honesty and mutual support. Nothing like the desperate situation that had brought him to my office doorstep. Years ago, I'd be honored, I said, accepting the envelope. As we discussed wedding details, I noticed something different about Jason. There was a groundedness to him now, a quiet confidence that had replaced his old pattern of manic enthusiasm followed by crushing disappointment. How's the new position going? I asked. 6 months earlier, he'd been offered a partnership at Spark Media, a significant achievement that reflected his contributions to the agency's growth. Challenging in the best ways, he replied. I'm working with the team to implement a profit-sharing structure that rewards long-term employees. Caroline's been incredibly supportive. That's a big change from the get-rich-quick days, I observed. He nodded, a rueful smile playing at his lips. Remember how I used to talk about being the next Mark Zuckerberg? Creating some revolutionary app that would make me an overnight billionaire? Vividly. The irony is, I'm actually happier now than I ever was chasing that fantasy. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. The work is meaningful, I'm good at it, and I'm building something sustainable. Not an empire, but a career I can be proud of. That's no small thing, I said. You know what else? He added. I finally paid off the last of my student loans last month. This caught me off guard. I didn't know you had student loans. From the 1.5 years I spent at MIT before dropping out to start Crypto Wave, he explained. Not nearly what you dealt with, but enough to be a burden all these years. Mom and Dad covered most of my tuition before everything happened. It was yet another reminder of how differently our parents had treated our education. The inequity still stung sometimes, but the sharp edge of betrayal had dulled with time and healing. I've been meaning to tell you, Jason continued, his tone growing more serious. The scholarship fund contribution I've been making monthly, I'm doubling it starting next quarter. The agency's doing well and Melissa got promoted at her job, so we're in a good position financially. 5 years into his commitment to contribute to the scholarship fund, Jason had already restored a significant portion of what had been taken. This increase would accelerate the timeline considerably. That's generous, Jason. The fund is making a real difference in these students' lives. He shook his head. It's not about generosity. It's about justice. What happened to you was wrong, and while I can't undo it, I can help make sure it creates something good for others. As we parted ways after coffee, I realized how profoundly our relationship had transformed. The resentment and distrust that had once defined my feelings toward Jason had been replaced by something I never expected. Respect. Not just brotherly affection, but genuine respect for the man he had become. Later that week, I drove to my parents' condo for dinner, something that had become a monthly tradition since Elena was born. Sarah was working late at the hospital, so it was just me and Elena, who was bubbling with excitement about seeing her grandparents. My relationship with my parents had reached a place of relative peace. We'd never fully addressed every aspect of what happened with my college fund. Some wounds are too complex to entirely resolve. But we'd found a way to build something new atop the complicated foundation of our past. As we pulled into the parking lot, Elena unbuckled her booster seat, impatient to reach the door. Do you think Grandpa made his famous spaghetti? She asked hopefully. He mentioned something about it when he called yesterday, I confirmed, smiling at her enthusiasm. My father had discovered a passion for cooking in retirement, focusing particularly on pasta dishes that Elena adored. It was one of the many small ways he showed love to his granddaughter. Consistent, reliable acts of care that were so different from the volatile favoritism of my childhood. When the door opened, my mother greeted Elena with a warm hug, then surprised me by embracing me as well. Physical affection had never been her default, making the gesture all the more meaningful. The apartment smelled deliciously of garlic and tomato sauce. My father emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron emblazoned with "World's Best Grandpa," a Father's Day gift from Elena the previous year. During dinner, my parents shared news about a community project they'd begun volunteering for, refurbishing computers for low-income students. My father's background in teaching and my mother's organizational skills had made them valuable additions to the team. "We're focusing on high school seniors applying to college," my mother explained, "making sure they have the technology they need for research and applications." "That's meaningful work," I said, struck by how their current efforts contrasted with their past choices. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they seemed to be channeling their energies into supporting educational access, perhaps their own form of atonement. After dinner, while Elena was showing my father a new drawing technique she'd learned in school, my mother pulled me aside. "I found something yesterday when I was organizing the storage closet," she said, disappearing briefly into the bedroom. She returned with a small wooden box I recognized immediately, my grandfather's keepsake box, where he'd stored mementos and important documents. "I thought you might want to have this," she said, handing it to me. I opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small leather journal. Beneath these lay a cream-colored envelope with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "I never saw this before," I said, looking questioningly at my mother. Her expression was complex, sadness mingled with resolve. "It was with his will documents. I kept it when we made the decision about your college fund. I was afraid of what it might say." With slightly shaking hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 3 months before my grandfather's death, when I was 13 years old. "Dear Ethan, by the time you read this, you'll be ready for college, and I'll have been gone for some years. Your grandmother and I have set aside funds for your education, knowing how much potential you have. You've always been the quiet observer in the family, taking everything in while your brother commands the spotlight. Don't underestimate this quality. The world needs thoughtful listeners as much as it needs bold innovators. Whatever path you choose, approach it with integrity and perseverance. These qualities will serve you better than any natural talent or advantage. Trust in your own capacity to grow and adapt, even when facing obstacles. The money we've saved is an investment in your future, but remember that the most valuable investments are those you make in yourself, in your character, your knowledge, and your relationships with others." With love and faith in who you are becoming, Grandpa read the letter twice, emotions washing over me in waves. My grandfather had seen me, really seen me, even when I felt invisible in my family. He'd recognized qualities in me that would later become the foundation of my professional success and personal resilience. Looking up at my mother, I saw tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered. "When I found this yesterday, I realized we hadn't just taken your money. We'd betrayed your grandfather's faith in us as stewards of his legacy." I carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "Why are you giving me this now?" She wiped her tears with a tissue. "Because you deserve to know how he saw you, and because I'm finally strong enough to face what we did without making excuses." It was the most complete acknowledgement she'd ever offered of the harm they'd caused. Not just financial harm, but the deeper wound of having my grandparents' intentions, for me, disregarded. I placed the wooden box and letter on the side table and did something that would have been unimaginable years earlier. I hugged my mother. Not out of obligation, but from a place of recognition that healing, however imperfect, was worth acknowledging. That night, after putting Elena to bed, I sat in my home office reading through my grandfather's journal. His observations about life, work, and family values resonated deeply, especially in light of my own journey. On one page, he'd written about watching me help my younger cousin learn to ride a bike, patiently running alongside, offering encouragement, never showing frustration. When progress was slow, Ethan demonstrates natural leadership through service, he'd noted, not commanding others, but empowering them. The insight struck me profoundly. My approach to leadership at Pinnacle, focusing on developing talent rather than merely directing, it echoed exactly what my grandfather had observed in me as a child. Without realizing it, I'd built my career on principles he'd recognized long before I understood them myself. Sarah found me there, still reading, when she returned from her late shift at the hospital. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the emotional weight in my expression. I showed her the letter and journal, explaining how my mother had finally returned them after all these years. Sarah read them carefully, then took my hand. "Your grandfather saw who you would become," she said softly, "even before you knew yourself." The following morning brought unexpected news at work. Pinnacle's CEO announced her intention to retire within the year, triggering a succession planning process that would reshape the company's leadership structure. As part of this transition, I was asked to join a strategic planning committee that would help determine Pinnacle's direction for the next decade. It was a significant vote of confidence in my vision and judgment, far beyond what my official role encompassed. During the initial committee meeting, I found myself drawing on principles from my grandfather's journal as I advocated for a more human-centered approach to our expansion plans. Rather than focusing solely on market penetration and profit margins, I emphasized sustainable growth that prioritized both employee development and community impact. What if we incorporated educational initiatives into our growth strategy? I suggested. Establishing scholarship and internship programs in each new market we enter, creating pipelines for local talent while addressing educational inequity. The team? Idea gained immediate traction, with several executive committee members building upon it. By the end of the meeting, we'd outlined a comprehensive approach that aligned business objectives with social responsibility, a framework that would eventually become Pinnacle's signature approach to market expansion. As I walked back to my office afterward, I received a text from the young woman I'd met at Professor Ramirez's class, thanking me for my encouragement and asking about application timelines for Pinnacle's internship program. I smiled, thinking about the circle that was completing itself. From being a struggling student myself, to being in a position to open doors for others facing similar challenges. From having educational opportunities taken from me to creating them for new generations. 2 months later, I stood at a podium in my old high school's auditorium, addressing the latest recipients of the scholarship fund that had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What had begun with $50,000, half from my parents' partial repayment, half from my own matching contribution, had expanded to over $300,000 through additional family contributions, corporate matching, and community support. This year, 5 students would receive funding, each with their own story of determination in the face of financial obstacles. Among them was a young man whose parents had immigrated from Guatemala, a young woman who had spent years in foster care, and a student who had maintained a 4.0 GPA while working nights at a local restaurant to help support his siblings. Education is not just about acquiring knowledge, I told them, looking out at their hopeful faces. It's about discovering who you are and what you're capable of becoming, often in circumstances that test your resolve. The challenges you've already overcome speak volumes about your character and potential. In the audience, I could see my parents, Jason and Melissa, Sarah with Elena on her lap, and even Caroline from Spark Media, who had become friends over the years. Each had contributed in their way to the healing journey that had made this moment possible. The weekend after the scholarship ceremony, our family gathered at a rented beach house on the Oregon coast, a rare opportunity for everyone to spend extended time together away from work responsibilities and daily routines. As I walked along the shoreline with Elena running ahead collecting shells, Sarah beside me and Jason and my parents following at a distance, I reflected on the long, complicated road that had brought us here. The betrayal of having my college fund redirected to Jason's startup had once seemed like the defining moment of my life, a wound so deep I couldn't imagine it ever fully healing. Yet here we were, years later, having built something none of us could have anticipated from those broken pieces. Not perfect reconciliation. The cracks would always be visible if you knew where to look. But something authentic and valuable, nonetheless. A family redefined by accountability rather than avoidance, by growth rather than grievance. Life rarely offers the clean resolutions we see in movies. Real healing comes not from erasing the past, but from transforming how it shapes our future. The college fund that was taken from me can never truly be replaced. Not just the money, but the security and trust it represented. Yet what grew in its place has proven more valuable than I could have imagined. Resilience that can't be shaken, relationships tested by fire and made stronger, and most importantly, the knowledge that our defining moments aren't the injuries we sustain, but the ways we choose to heal from them. My brother's startup was once deemed the better investment by those who should have protected my interests. It failed, as most startups do. But the investment I made in myself, in perseverance, in principled leadership, in the capacity to forge a path entirely my own, continues to yield returns that can't be measured in dollars. And the ultimate investment? The one that transcends personal achievement or financial security? It's what we're building now, a legacy of education, opportunity, and second chances that will outlast all of us. Sometimes the greatest victories emerge from our most painful defeats. Not because the pain wasn't real or didn't matter, but because we refused to let it have the final word in our story. 10 years after Jason walked into my office with his inflated resume, I found myself in the most pivotal meeting of my career. Pinnacle's board of directors had narrowed their CEO succession search to 3 internal candidates, and I was among them. A development I couldn't have imagined when I'd started as a marketing team member all those years ago. The final round of interviews had been grueling. Presentations on 5-year strategic plans, intensive sessions with board members, psychological assessments, and performance evaluations. Now, sitting at the polished conference table waiting for the board's decision, I reflected on the winding path that had brought me here. When I joined Pinnacle, I was still paying off student loans, still carrying the chip on my shoulder from my parents' betrayal, still determined to prove myself in spite of the obstacles placed in my way. Now, a decade later, I was being considered to lead the entire organization, not because of family connections or privilege, but because of consistent performance and vision. The boardroom door opened, and the chair of the board entered, followed by the current CEO and the head of the search committee. Their expressions gave nothing away as they took their seats across from me. "Ethan," the chair began, "we've been extremely impressed with your performance throughout this process. Your strategic vision for Pinnacle's future aligns with where the board believes this company needs to go. And your track record of building high-performing teams speaks for itself." He paused, sliding a folder across the table. "We're pleased to offer you the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective when Diana retires in 3 months." The words took a moment to register fully. I opened the folder, seeing the formal offer letter with terms that exceeded my expectations. It wasn't just the title or the compensation that moved me. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun in adversity and led to this moment of validation. "This is a tremendous honor," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. "Thank you for your confidence. I won't let you down." As we discussed transition timelines and announcement strategies, I thought about the people who would be most surprised, and perhaps most affected, by this news. My family. That night, I asked my parents, Jason and Melissa, to join Sarah, Elena, and me for dinner, saying only that I had important news to share. My father volunteered to cook, and everyone gathered at our home, curious about the announcement. Elena, now 10 years old and perceptive beyond her years, watched me closely as I helped set the table. "Did you get a new job, Dad?" she asked. "You have that look you had when you got promoted last time." I smiled, ruffling her hair. "Let's wait until everyone's here, okay?" When the family had assembled around our dining room table, I stood with a glass of sparkling cider. "I asked you all here because I wanted to share some significant news with the people who matter most to me." I took a breath. Today, I was offered the position of CEO at Pinnacle. I've accepted. The room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Sarah, who'd been keeping my secret since I'd whispered it to her when I'd arrived home, beamed with pride. Elena bounced excitedly in her chair, asking if this meant I'd be the boss of everybody. My mother burst into tears, while my father sat stunned, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pride. Jason was the first to stand, coming around the table to embrace me. "No one deserves this more," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You built this, Ethan. Every step of the way you earned it." Coming from him, these words carried special weight. There had been a time when Jason couldn't recognize achievement unless it came with dramatic flair and overnight success. Now he understood the value of steady progress, of building something, substantial brick by brick over time. Later, as we enjoyed dessert on the back patio, my father pulled me aside. He'd been unusually quiet throughout dinner, and I could tell something was weighing on him. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, his voice low. "When we told you about taking your college fund for Jason's startup, how devastated you looked, how we dismissed your concerns." I tensed slightly. We hadn't spoken directly about that night in years. "I want you to know," he continued, "that not a day goes by that I don't regret that decision. Not just because the business failed, but because of what it revealed about us as parents, about our failure to treat you both with equal consideration and respect." He looked at me, his eyes damp. "And yet, look at you now, CEO of a major corporation. I'd like to think we had something to do with your success, but the truth is, you succeeded despite us, not because of us." "That's not entirely true," I replied after a moment. "You and Mom gave me a strong work ethic, a solid education through high school, and in your own way, you taught me what kind of leader I didn't want to be, one who plays favorites or makes decisions based on who shines brightest in the moment rather than who puts in the consistent effort." He winced at this but nodded. "Fair enough. I just want you to know how proud I am, not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become in the process." My mother joined us then, having overheard parts of our conversation. "The scholarship program," she said. "It's going to be your legacy, isn't it? More than even this CEO position." I considered this. I hope both will be part of my legacy. But yes, the scholarship has special meaning. It transforms something that was taken from me into something that gives to others. My first day as Pinnacle's Chief Executive Officer began with a company-wide town hall. Employees filled the auditorium at headquarters, with teams from other locations joining virtually. The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty about the leadership transition. Diana, the outgoing CEO, introduced me warmly before symbolically handing over her office keys. As I stepped to the podium, I saw familiar faces in the audience, colleagues who'd been with me since my early days at the company, team members I'd mentored, even Caroline from Spark Media who'd come to support me at Jason's invitation. "Today marks a new chapter for Pinnacle," I began. "But our core values remain unchanged. We will continue to innovate, to serve our clients with excellence, and to develop the talent that makes this organization exceptional. But I want to add a new dimension to our mission." I outlined my vision for expanding Pinnacle's educational initiatives, not as charity but as strategic investment in future talent and community goodwill. The Pinnacle Pathways program would formalize our scholarship and internship offerings, creating clear routes for ambitious students from disadvantaged backgrounds to join our industry. My own path to this podium was neither straight nor easy. I shared, deciding at that moment to be more transparent than I'd initially planned. I worked my way through college under financial constraints that seemed insurmountable at the time. That experience shaped my belief that talent and potential exist everywhere, but opportunity does not. Our job is to bridge that gap, not just because it's right, but because it makes us stronger as a company. The response was overwhelming. Employees from similar backgrounds approached me afterward, sharing their own stories and offering to mentor scholarship recipients. Board members expressed enthusiasm for the initiative, recognizing its potential for positive PR and long-term talent development. Within 6 months, we'd established Pinnacle Pathways programs in every city where we operated, partnering with local high schools and community colleges to identify promising candidates. The corporate foundation I established committed 1% of annual profits to educational initiatives, with employee matching gifts amplifying the impact. A year into my tenure as CEO, I accepted an invitation to speak at a Career Day event at my old high school in Portland. Standing in the same auditorium where I'd once received my diploma, and where we now presented our scholarship awards each year, I faced a room full of students at the same crossroads I'd once faced. Success isn't a straight line, I told them. It's not about avoiding obstacles, but about how you navigate them. Every setback offers a choice, to become bitter or to become better. That choice, more than any external circumstance, determines your path. I shared parts of my story that I rarely discussed publicly. The night my college funding disappeared, the struggle to balance multiple jobs with academics, the weight of student loans that had followed me for years. Not to elicit sympathy, but to illustrate that starting points don't determine destinations. After my talk, the school principal introduced me to a student named Marcus, who had recently been awarded one of our scholarships. His situation resonated deeply with me. His college fund had been used by his parents to save their home during a financial crisis. Though the circumstances differed from mine, the impact was similar. A young person forced to forge their own path without expected support. I was angry for a long time, Marcus confided as we talked in the hallway. Felt like they chose the house over my future. I nodded, understanding completely. That anger is natural, but what you do with it makes all the difference. Your scholarship program, he said, it changed everything for me. Not just the money, but knowing someone believed I could make it anyway. In that moment, I saw the full circle of my journey. From the betrayed teenager to the successful executive using his position to ensure others didn't face the same barriers. It wasn't about erasing what had happened, but about transforming its energy into something constructive. 6 months later, I found myself in an unexpected position, sitting across from Jason in his office, not as brothers, but as potential business partners. After years of success at Spark Media, Jason had branched out to establish his own boutique agency focused on digital marketing for socially conscious businesses. Now he was pitching Pinnacle on a comprehensive rebrand to highlight our educational initiatives. The proposal was impressive, thoughtful, strategic, and aligned with our goals. More striking was watching Jason present it with confidence tempered by humility, answering questions with substance rather than flash, acknowledging limitations while offering creative solutions. This was not the brother who had once believed. His ideas deserved funding simply because they were his. This was a seasoned professional who had earned his expertise through consistent effort and gradual mastery. The very qualities I'd always valued, but he'd once dismissed as too slow and ordinary. When his team left the conference room for us to deliberate, I stayed behind with Jason. That was excellent, I told him honestly. Your approach to integrating our educational messaging into the broader brand narrative is exactly what we've been missing. Thanks, he said, obviously pleased but not smug. We've spent a lot of time studying Pinnacle Pathways and its impact. The stories of these students, they're powerful, Ethan. You've created something remarkable here. We've all contributed, I acknowledged, thinking of his consistent donations to the original scholarship fund that had evolved into Pinnacle Pathways. But I have to ask, will it be weird for you if we work together professionally, me as the client, you as the agency? He considered this seriously. 5 years ago? Probably. But now? I think we've both grown enough to navigate those waters. Besides, Melissa would never let me hear the end of it if I let ego get in the way of the agency's biggest potential client. I laughed, appreciating his self-awareness. Well, the committee will make the final decision, but you should know your proposal is by far the strongest we've seen. 2 weeks later, Pinnacle officially engaged Jason's agency for the rebrand. Our professional collaboration added a new dimension to our relationship, one based on mutual respect for each other's expertise and accomplishments. As Elena entered her junior year of high school, we began visiting potential colleges. A crisp fall day, we toured the University of Washington, the very campus where I'd once worked night shifts as a security guard while struggling to stay awake in classes. Walking familiar paths with my daughter was surreal. The buildings were the same, but my perspective had transformed completely. No longer the exhausted student wondering how he'd make it through another semester, but a successful executive showing his child possibilities for her future. Did you always know you wanted to study business? Elena asked as we sat on a bench near the fountain. Actually, I was initially drawn to marketing because it seemed practical, a field where I could find stable employment to pay off my loans, I answered. Honestly, but I grew to love the strategic aspects, the psychology of it. Sometimes the paths we choose out of necessity become our passion. Elena nodded thoughtfully. She knew parts of my story. We'd shared age-appropriate versions over the years. But was now old enough to understand the complexities. I've been thinking about majoring in social policy, she said. Maybe law school afterward. I want to work on educational access issues. My heart swelled with pride. Without pushing her, in any direction, we'd raised a daughter who recognized the value of creating opportunity for others. Whether influenced by the scholarship program or simply by observing our family's journey, she'd developed a sense of purpose focused on making paths easier for those who followed. Whatever you choose, I told her, your mom and I will support you completely. You have college funds set aside, and they're untouchable for anything but your education. I smiled, acknowledging the deliberate contrast with my own experience. That's a promise. For my 50th birthday, Sarah organized a surprise celebration that brought together family, friends, and colleagues from throughout my life. The gathering was held at a lakeside venue, with guests ranging from my parents' age to young scholarship recipients just beginning their careers. During the party, I was touched to see several former scholarship students now employed at Pinnacle or other prestigious firms, their success stories reinforcing the value of the program we'd built. Even more moving was overhearing my father deep in conversation with one of them, listening intently to her journey and offering genuine encouragement. My parents had evolved significantly over the years. The father who had once dismissed my concerns about taking my college fund was now one of the most vocal advocates for educational support for disadvantaged students. My mother volunteered weekly with a local literacy program, helping first-generation college students navigate application processes. These changes hadn't erased history, but they'd created a new chapter that could exist alongside the painful parts of our story. Redemption not through forgetting, but through growth and meaningful amends. As the evening progressed, Jason asked for everyone's attention, raising his glass of sparkling cider in solidarity with my continued sobriety. Most of you know parts of our family's complicated history, he began, his voice steady. What many of you don't know is that 15 years ago, I was the beneficiary of a tremendously unfair decision that disadvantaged my brother significantly. The room fell silent, guests exchanging curious glances. Ethan had every reason to cut me out of his life, Jason continued. Instead, he chose a harder path, holding me accountable while leaving the door open for me to become someone better. His example taught me that true strength isn't about dominating others or pursuing quick success, but about maintaining your integrity even when it costs you. He turned to face me directly. The scholarship fund that has helped so many students began as Ethan's response to what was taken from him. Instead of becoming bitter, he created something that has transformed hundreds of lives. That's the measure of the man we're celebrating tonight. The morning after the party, I woke early and walked down to the lake's edge as the sun was rising. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the pink and gold sky in a mirror image that blurred the boundary between reality and reflection. As I stood there, I thought about the concept of legacy, what we leave behind that truly matters. My position as CEO would eventually end. Pinnacle itself might be acquired or evolve into something unrecognizable. Even the scholarship program would someday be administered by people who never knew its origins in a family's betrayal and a young man's determination to create meaning from that wound. What would endure, I hoped, was the ripple effect. Each scholarship recipient going on to create opportunity for others. Each family member carrying forward the lessons of our reconciliation. Each colleague I'd mentored passing on the values of ethical leadership and genuine inclusion. The college fund my grandparents established for me was intended as an investment in my future. Its loss became an unexpected investment in my character, in resilience, in self-reliance, in the determination to succeed despite obstacles. My brother's startup, once deemed the better investment, failed financially but succeeded in ways none of us could have anticipated. It became the catalyst for a painful but necessary family transformation, forcing us to confront patterns of favoritism and entitlement that had damaged all of us in different ways. Sometimes life's most valuable lessons come disguised as its greatest injustices. The key is not to avoid the pain but to transform it, to use it as fuel for growth rather than as an excuse for bitterness or stagnation. My parents' decision to give my college fund to my brother's startup was objectively wrong, but would I undo it if I could? I'm no longer sure. The path it set me on, difficult as it was, led to a fullness of life and achievement that I might never have found otherwise. Perhaps that's the ultimate reconciliation, not just with my family, but with the past itself. Not dismissing the wrong that was done, but recognizing that our responses to life's injustices define us more powerfully than the injustices themselves. And in the end, the better investment wasn't a startup or a college fund. It was the decision to build rather than destroy, to grow rather than diminish, to transform pain into purpose. An investment not in what we possess, but in who we become. 15 years had passed since I stepped into the role of CEO at Pinnacle. Innovations. Now at 65, I was preparing for retirement, boxing up mementos from a career that had exceeded all my youthful expectations. The company had more than tripled in size during my tenure, expanding across 3 continents, while maintaining the values and culture I'd worked to instill. More importantly, the Pinnacle Pathways program had supported over 1,000 students through college and launched countless careers, creating a ripple effect that would continue long after my departure. As I carefully wrapped a framed photo of the first scholarship recipients, my assistant knocked on the door. "Your daughter is here," she said with a smile. Elena walked in, now 35 and radiating confidence. After earning her law degree and working for a prestigious firm, she'd transitioned to the nonprofit sector, leading an organization dedicated to educational equity. The little girl who'd once asked if being CEO meant I was boss of everybody had become a formidable advocate for systemic change. "How's it feel to be packing up?" she asked, surveying the half-empty bookshelves and bare walls. "Surreal," I admitted. "But it's time. The new leadership team is solid, the transition plan is in place, and I'm ready for the next chapter." She picked up a weathered wooden box from my desk, my grandfather's keepsake box that had occupied a place of honor in my office for years. "Are you taking this home?" Of course. Some things are too precious to leave behind. We continued packing, in comfortable silence for a while, until Elena paused, holding a photograph I hadn't seen in years. A faded snapshot of me in my cap and gown at college graduation, dark circles under my eyes but determination in my expression. "I've always loved this picture," she said softly. "You look exhausted, but unstoppable." I smiled, remembering that day, how I'd worked a security shift the night before, catching only 2 hours of sleep before the ceremony. How none of my family had attended because my relationship with them was still too damaged. How I'd felt both utterly alone and fiercely proud of what I'd accomplished despite everything. That was a pivotal moment, I told her. I remember thinking, I did this. Despite everything, I did this. It was the first time I truly believed I could create my own path, regardless of the obstacles. Elena studied the photo thoughtfully. "You know, the story of what happened with your college fund and everything that followed. It shaped my life, too. Not just the scholarship program or meeting the students we've helped, but watching how you transformed something painful into something purposeful." She placed the photo carefully in a box. "That's why I chose the work I do. I wanted to create those opportunities for others, to help people find their strength and potential, especially when the systems that should support them fail." My retirement celebration was held in Pinnacle's headquarters atrium, transformed for the evening, into an elegant venue with subtle touches that reflected my tenure. The guest list included colleagues from throughout my career, scholarship recipients from every year of the program, and of course, my family. Jason, now in his late 60s and semi-retired from his agency, had flown in from New York where he'd opened a branch office 5 years earlier. Our parents, now in their late 80s, had made the trip despite my father's health challenges, determined to be present for this milestone. The formal program included speeches from board members and executives, a video tribute from employees worldwide, and the announcement of a new initiative, the Ethan Miller Leadership Academy, which would provide advanced training for promising employees from non-traditional backgrounds. When it was my turn to speak, I surveyed the room, hundreds of faces representing different chapters of my journey, from Sarah, who had supported me through every triumph and challenge, to former mentors who'd given me chances when I needed them most. "They say that adversity doesn't build character, it reveals it," I began. "In my experience, it does both. The obstacles we face strip away pretense and show us who we truly are, but they also shape who we become through our responses to them." I shared brief reflections on my unlikely path from struggling student to corporate leader, careful not to frame it as a simple success story, but as a complex human journey with many contributors. The scholarship program that grew into Pinnacle, Pathways, began with a personal experience of educational opportunity being taken away, but it flourished because so many of you recognized its value and contributed your own energy, resources, and vision. What started as one person's attempt to make meaning from difficulty became a collective commitment to expanding opportunity. As the formal program concluded and guests mingled, I found myself in conversation with Deanna Martinez, one of our earliest scholarship recipients who now served as Pinnacle's Chief Marketing Officer, positioned to be a strong candidate for FY CEO within the next decade. "I've been meaning to ask you something for years," she said. "When you interviewed me for that first internship, you mentioned that you understood the struggle of working multiple jobs through college. Was that just something you said to candidates, or was there more to it?" I hesitated, then decided on transparency. There was much more to it. My college fund was taken for another purpose when I was 17. I worked night security shifts and weekend jobs throughout my degree, taking on significant debt to make it through. Her eyes widened. "That's not the background story I would have imagined for someone in your position." Most people's paths are more complicated than they appear from the outside, I told her. Which is why I've always believed in looking beyond traditional credentials to see a person's full potential and determination. She nodded thoughtfully. That explains a lot about your leadership approach. The emphasis on creating opportunity, the commitment to looking beyond obvious candidates. The best leaders are those who remember what it felt like to need a chance, I replied. Don't lose that awareness as you continue to rise in the organization. A week after my retirement became official, Sarah and I drove to Portland to help my parents with a significant transition of their own. After resisting for years, they'd finally decided to sell the family home and move into a senior living community that could provide the support my father increasingly needed. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its once proud appearance now showing signs of deferred maintenance as my parents' energy and mobility had declined. Inside, decades of accumulated possessions awaited sorting, a task my parents had been overwhelmed by until Jason and I arranged to help. My childhood bedroom had long since been converted to a craft room for my mother's quilting, but being in the house still evoked complex emotions, memories of feeling secondary to Jason's golden child status, the devastating night when I learned my college fund was gone, but also earlier, simpler times of family dinners and holiday celebrations. In Amiyai, the basement, Sarah and I tackled boxes of old school papers and childhood memorabilia. In one dusty container, I found a stack of report cards and certificates, mine and Jason's, stored together in no particular order. As I flipped through them, I noticed something I'd never seen before. On the back of one of my elementary school report cards in my father's handwriting was a note. Ethan shows remarkable persistence. When he struggles with a concept, he doesn't give up until he masters it. This quieter form of intelligence may serve him better in the long run than Jason's flashier aptitude. I stared at the note, written when I was just 9 years old. Even then, my father had recognized something valuable in my approach, though he'd rarely expressed it directly to me. It was a small thing, yet it shifted something in my understanding of my childhood. Perhaps I hadn't been as invisible as I'd felt. Later that afternoon, as we sorted through financial records in my father's office, I came across a folder labeled Ethan's Education. Inside were the original documents establishing my college, fund, correspondence with the financial institution, and a surprising addition, a handwritten ledger where my father had recorded every contribution he and my mother had made to the scholarship fund over the years. The total far exceeded what they'd initially sent as partial repayment. Without fanfare or seeking credit, they had consistently allocated portions of their modest retirement income to supporting students through the program. When I brought this discovery to my father, who was resting in his recliner, his expression was a mixture of embarrassment and resolution. "We could never fully make it right," he said quietly. "But we wanted to try, in whatever small way we could." In that moment, I saw more clearly than ever how our family story had come full circle, from profound breach of trust to sustained effort at making amends, however imperfect. 3 months into retirement, Sarah and I hosted a family weekend at our lake house, a tradition we'd established years earlier, but now had more time to enjoy. Jason and Melissa were there, along with Elena and her husband Marco with their 2 children. My parents had moved to their new senior community, but were well enough to join us for the gathering. As we enjoyed lunch on the deck overlooking the water, my mother smiled at the scene before her. 4 generations together, the youngest playing happily without awareness of the complex history that had preceded their existence. "I never imagined we'd get here," she said softly to me. "After what happened? I was afraid we'd lost you forever." "There were times when that could have happened," I acknowledged. "Times when it would have been easier to cut ties than to do the work of rebuilding." "What made you keep trying?" she asked. "You would have been justified in walking away." I considered this question carefully, watching Elena helping her daughter build a sandcastle by the shore, the same patient guidance I remembered my grandfather showing me. Partly it was recognizing that resentment was a heavier burden than forgiveness, I said finally. And partly it was understanding that while I couldn't change what happened, I could determine what meaning I created from it. I didn't add the final reason, that despite everything, these complicated, flawed people were still my family, and the bond, though damaged, had never fully broken. Some things didn't need to be articulated to be understood. Later that evening, as the younger generation slept and the adults gathered around a fire pit under the stars, Jason raised his mug of hot chocolate. "To retirement," he toasted, "though knowing Ethan it'll be busier than most people's careers." Everyone laughed, knowing it was true. I'd already accepted positions on 2 nonprofit boards focused on educational access and was mentoring several promising executives from underrepresented backgrounds. "It's not retirement so much as redirection," I acknowledged. "There's still work I want to do, just on different terms." My father, more frail now but still sharp-minded, leaned forward. "I've been thinking about the concept of investment lately," he said, his voice softer than in his younger years but still carrying authority. "Not just financial investment, but where we put our energy, our attention, our hope." The group grew quiet, sensing the weight of his words. "The worst mistake of my life was treating Ethan's future as less valuable than Jason's potential startup," he continued. "But watching how Ethan transformed that betrayal into something meaningful taught me more about true investment than any financial advisor ever could." He looked at me directly. "You invested in yourself when no one else would. Then you invested in others facing similar obstacles. The returns on those investments, in confidence, in opportunity, in human potential, those are the ones that truly matter." The following morning, I woke before sunrise and walked down to the lake alone, drawn to the stillness of early dawn. As the first light touched the water, I reflected on the long, improbable journey from betrayed teenager to retired CEO, from estranged son and brother to the center of a reconciled, if imperfect, family. The college fund that had been taken from me had long since been eclipsed by what I'd built, professionally, personally, and in the educational opportunities created for others. The pain of that early betrayal had faded, not because it didn't matter, but because it had been transformed into something of far greater value. My brother's startup, once deemed the better investment, had indeed failed financially. But its failure had catalyzed growth and change that no successful business venture could have matched. For Jason, who had to rebuild himself from a place of humility. For my parents, who had to confront their own misplaced values. And for me, who had discovered strengths I might never have known otherwise. Life rarely offers the resolution we think we want. The betrayals that wound us deeply don't get undone. The time and opportunities lost can't be recovered. But within that unchangeable reality lies the seed of something powerful. The freedom to create meaning from what has happened to us. Had my college fund remained untouched, I might have taken an easier path through education and career. I might never have developed the resilience, work ethic, and determination that ultimately defined my professional success. I might never have recognized the systemic barriers that make education inaccessible to so many talented individuals, or felt compelled to address them. The scholarship program that grew from that initial wound will continue supporting students long after I'm gone. The values I work to embed in Pinnacle's culture will influence decisions and priorities beyond my tenure. The example I've tried to set for my daughter and grandchildren may shape how they respond to their own challenges and opportunities. In the end, perhaps my parents were right, though not in the way they intended. My brother's startup was indeed a better investment, not financially, but in the growth, purpose, and legacy it ultimately inspired through its very failure. Each of us faces moments where life takes an unexpected and seemingly unfair turn. In those moments, we have a choice: to be defined by what happens to us, or to define ourselves by how we respond. To become bitter about what was taken, or to become better because of what we found within ourselves. I chose to build rather than break, to transform rather than merely endure. And in that choice, made again and again through decades of challenges and opportunities, I found not just success, but meaning. Not just achievement, but purpose. Not just reconciliation with my family, but peace within myself. That's an investment that pays dividends no financial advisor could ever calculate. The returns of a life fully lived, with all its complications, contradictions, and ultimately, its completeness. 2 weeks after our family gathering, I received an unexpected email from a name I didn't recognize, Michael Thompson. The subject line read, "You changed my life 20 years ago." Intrigued, I opened it to find a message from one of the very first scholarship recipients. Michael explained that he'd recently learned I had retired and wanted to share what had happened in his life since receiving the scholarship. After graduating, with an engineering degree, he'd worked for several major tech companies before founding his own firm specializing in renewable energy solutions. His company now employed over 300 people and had pioneered solar technology being implemented across developing nations. The scholarship wasn't just financial assistance, he wrote. It was a vote of confidence when I most needed it. Knowing someone believed in my potential enough to invest in it gave me the courage to pursue goals that seemed impossible from where I started. He attached a photo of himself with a group of young people, the recipients of a scholarship program he had established at his former high school, modeled after the one that had helped him. The ripple effect was tangible. One act of transforming. Pain into purpose had inspired another, which would likely inspire more. The exponential impact stretched beyond what I could track or measure. I shared the email with Sarah over dinner, both of us moved by this unexpected glimpse into how far our efforts had reached. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when we first met, you were still carrying so much anger about what happened with your college fund. I remember thinking you might never fully move beyond it." "What changed your mind?" I asked, curious about her perception. "The scholarship fund," she replied without hesitation. "When you established it, I saw something shift in you. It wasn't just about making peace with your past. It was about reshaping it into something meaningful." She reached for my hand across the table. I fell in love with the man who could do that, who could take his deepest wound and transform it into healing for others. The following month, I accepted an invitation to speak at the University of Washington's Business School commencement. Walking across the campus where I had once struggled as a student, working nights and weekends to make ends meet, felt surreal. The buildings were largely the same, but everything else had changed, including me. In preparing my address, I decided to be more open than I typically had been during my corporate career. These graduates were entering a world of unprecedented economic uncertainty. Platitudes about following their dreams wouldn't serve them. Honest insights about navigating adversity might. Standing at the podium looking out at hundreds of graduates and their families, I set aside my prepared notes and spoke from experience. "The conventional commencement speech tells you that today marks the beginning of your journey," I began. "The truth is, you're already well into it. The challenges you've overcome to reach this moment, financial pressures, personal doubts, competing responsibilities, these aren't just obstacles you've passed. They're investments in who you're becoming." I shared parts of my story I rarely disclosed in professional settings: the loss of my college fund, the grueling schedule of classes and multiple jobs, the weight of student debt that had followed me for years. Society often measures success by ease, the absence of struggle, the smoothness of one's path. I propose a different metric: how effectively you transform struggle into strength, setbacks into insights, and personal pain into positive impact. After the ceremony, a line of graduates waited to speak with me. One young woman, supporting herself on crutches, approached with tears in her eyes. My parents lost everything in the housing market crash when I was 15, she said. I've worked 2 jobs throughout college while dealing with a chronic illness. Sometimes I've felt so alone in that struggle, wondering if it was worth it. It is, I assured her. Not despite the struggle, but because of what the struggle is teaching you. I gave her my email address, offering to connect her with Pinnacle's recruiting team. Her determination reminded me of my own journey, and I recognized in her the same resilience that had carried me forward when circumstances were most challenging. 6 months into retirement, I began writing a book, not a conventional business memoir focused on professional triumphs, but an honest exploration of how personal adversity shapes leadership philosophy. The working title was Better Investment: Transforming Setback into Strength. The process of documenting my journey forced me to examine aspects of the story I'd never fully processed. I interviewed family members for their perspectives, uncovering nuances and motivations I hadn't previously understood. Jason revealed that he'd spent years in therapy addressing the impact of our parents' favoritism on his development, how being labeled the genius had created impossible expectations and a fear of failure that led to impulsive decisions. The startup failing was the best thing that could have happened to me, he admitted during one of our conversations. It shattered the illusion that I was destined for automatic success and forced me to build something real, brick by brick. My mother shared that her push to invest my college fund in Jason's venture had been partly driven by her own unfulfilled ambitions. The daughter of immigrants who emphasized practical career paths, she had abandoned her artistic aspirations early on. Jason's creative tech ideas represented the bold risk-taking she'd never permitted herself. I projected so much onto him, she acknowledged. And in doing so, I failed to see the steady strength you were developing. I measured potential by flash rather than substance. These insights didn't excuse what had happened, but they added dimension to a narrative I had simplified in my own mind. The betrayal wasn't just about favoring one son over another. It was about complex human weaknesses, unresolved regrets, and misguided attempts to correct perceived shortcomings. The 25th anniversary of the scholarship program coincided with my first year of retirement. What had begun as a personal effort to create meaning from injustice had evolved into an institutional commitment, reaching far beyond anything I could have envisioned. Pinnacle Pathways now supported students not just through undergraduate education, but into graduate studies and early career development. For the anniversary celebration, we arranged a special ceremony bringing together recipients from all 25 years, from established professionals in their 40s to fresh-faced high school seniors just beginning their journey. The event was held at Pinnacle's headquarters, symbolizing the connection between educational opportunity and professional advancement. As I looked out at the gathered recipients, over 100 individuals whose lives had been directly impacted by the program, I was struck by the diversity of their paths. Some had pursued careers in business and technology, others in education, healthcare, public service, and the arts. They represented not a single definition of success, but the multiplicity of ways human potential can flourish when given the chance. During the reception, I found myself in conversation with an older gentleman who introduced himself as the father of one of our earliest scholarship recipients. My daughter was brilliant but shy, he told me. We couldn't afford to send her to college, and she was too timid to pursue scholarships on her own. Your program administrator reached out directly after her counselor nominated her. He gripped my hand firmly. She's a research scientist now, developing treatments for autoimmune diseases. I wanted you to know that your program didn't just change her life. It's changing thousands of lives through her work. These cascading effects, impossible to predict or fully trace, represented the true legacy of what we'd built. From a single act of personal resilience had grown a network of opportunity that would continue expanding long after I was gone. A year after beginning my book, I was invited to the dedication of a memorial garden at my old high school. The project, funded by alumni donations, honored educators who had made significant impacts on generations of students. Among those being recognized was Mr. Harrington, my economics teacher who had written my college recommendation letters and encouraged me when my plans were derailed. The garden featured stone benches inscribed with quotes from each honored teacher. Mr. Harrington's read, "Your circumstances do not define your potential. Your response to them does." I ran my fingers over the engraved words, remembering how he had stayed after school to help me research alternate funding options when my college fund disappeared. He had been one of the few adults who didn't minimize the impact of what had happened or suggest I simply get over it. Instead, he had acknowledged the unfairness while refusing to let me surrender to it. "This obstacle is real," he had told me, "and so is your capacity to overcome it." Standing in the garden surrounded by spring blossoms, I realized how many people had contributed to my journey, not by removing obstacles, but by helping me develop the strength to navigate them. Mr. Harrington, Professor Ramirez, who had given me flexible deadlines when my work schedule became overwhelming, Diana, the former CEO who had recognized leadership potential in a young marketing manager still paying off student loans. Alongside the pain of betrayal had always been the countervailing force of support from unexpected sources. My story had never been solely about what was taken from me, but also about what was given, often by people who had no obligation to invest in my future, but chose to anyway. As I entered the second year of retirement, my role as grandpa took precedence over former professional identities. Elena's children, now 8 and 6, spent weekends with Sarah and me at the lake house while their parents traveled for work or simply enjoyed a well-deserved break. One rainy afternoon, my grandson Max found my grandfather's wooden keepsake box while exploring a bookshelf. Curious, he brought it to me, asking what treasures it might contain. I opened it carefully, showing him the photographs, letters, and journal. "This belonged to my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather," I explained. "He was a wise man who saw something special in me when I was about your age." "What did he see?" Max asked, genuine curiosity in his eyes. "He saw that I was patient and determined," I told him, "that I didn't give up easily when things were difficult." Max considered this thoughtfully. "Mom says that about me too, that I keep trying even when it's hard." "That's one of the most valuable qualities a person can have," I told him, recognizing the continuation of a family strength passing through generations. More valuable than being the fastest or the loudest or even the smartest. Later, as the children played a board game with Sarah, I added a new item to my grandfather's keepsake box, a copy of my finished book, now ready for publication. The manuscript represented my attempt to distill the wisdom gained through decades of transforming adversity into opportunity. Its final chapter wasn't about professional accomplishments or even the scholarship program's success. Instead, it focused on the personal peace I'd finally achieved. Not by forgetting the betrayal that had shaped my journey, but by recognizing how it had ultimately expanded rather than diminished my life. As the sun set over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I contemplated the arc of my story, from the devastated teenager whose educational future had been compromised, to the determined student working night shifts to make ends meet, to the corporate leader creating opportunities for others facing similar obstacles. The college fund that was redirected to my brother's startup had been intended as an investment in my future. In its absence, I had been forced to invest more deeply in myself, in my resilience, my work ethic, my determination, to succeed despite the odds. Those investments had yielded returns far greater than any financial portfolio could have produced. My brother's startup, once deemed the better investment, had failed financially. Yet it had succeeded in ways none of us could have anticipated, compelling each family member to confront painful truths, dismantle unhealthy patterns, and Reconstruct relationships on more authentic foundations. The scholarship program born from that experience had created opportunities for hundreds of students, many of whom were now creating similar opportunities for others. The ripple effect would continue long after I was gone, an endless expansion of potential unleashed in lives I would never know. If given the chance to go back and prevent what happened, to ensure my college fund remained untouched and my path unobstructed, would I take it? The question was impossible to answer with certainty. The pain had been real, the struggle had been exhausting, the sense of betrayal had altered my fundamental trust in family. Yet without that defining challenge, I might never have discovered the depth of my own capacity to overcome obstacles. I might never have developed the leadership philosophy that ultimately shaped Pinnacle's culture and my own approach to creating opportunity. I might never have recognized so clearly how educational access determines not just individual futures, but collective progress. Perhaps the true measure of healing is not that we would choose to relive our most painful experiences, but that we can recognize how they have expanded rather than diminished our lives. Not that the injury disappears, but that it transforms into wisdom, empathy, and purpose that would not have existed otherwise. In the final accounting, the better investment wasn't a startup or a college fund. It was the decision to create, meaning from difficulty to build rather than break, to transform pain into purpose. An investment not in what we own or achieve, but in who we become and what we create for others. That investment continues to pay dividends beyond anything I could have imagined that devastating night when my future seemed to crumble. Not because the injury wasn't real, but because the response to it created possibilities that stretched beyond the horizons of what was taken. In the end, we are defined not by the wounds we receive, but by the healing we generate. For ourselves, and, if we're fortunate, for others walking similar paths. That is the legacy worth building, the investment that truly matters, the return that enriches not just a single life, but the expanding circle of lives we touch along the way. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.